Welcome to the top-rated and award-nominated Grad School Femtoring podcast, the place for first-gen BIPOCs to learn about all things grad school, personal development, and sustainable productivity. This is Doctora Yvette Martinez-Vu, and I will be serving as your Femtor, providing you with tips and tricks and everything else you need to know to successfully navigate grad school and beyond. For over 13 years, I've been empowering first-gen students of color along their academic and professional journeys, and I'm really excited to support you too. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Grad School Femtoring podcast. This is your host, Doctora Yvette, and today we are going to be talking about the pursuit of equity and justice in Hispanic-serving institutions. And I'm excited because I've got La Mera Mera, Doctora Gina Ann Garcia here. She is a professor in the Berkeley School of Education. Full professor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Dr. Gina's research centers on issues of equity and diversity in higher education with an emphasis on understanding how Hispanic-serving institutions, HSIs, embrace and enact an organizational identity for serving minoritized populations. She is the author of Becoming Hispanic-Serving Institutions, Opportunities for Colleges and Universities, as well as Transforming Hispanic-Serving Institutions for Equity and Justice. She is also the host of the podcast, Que Pasa HSIs. Welcome to the podcast, Doctora Gina.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Yay, me too. So I would love for folks to hear a little bit more about you, about your background, your Black story. How did you become who you are? Just let us know the details. I know it's a big question, but I would love to hear a little bit more about you.
Oh, how did I become who I am? That right there. We'll be here a while. But I mean, I'll just go ahead and talk a little bit about my journey into higher education and how I got to where I am today. I am born and raised Cali girl, Cali all the way through and through. And yes, I am returning actually to California for the professorship at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, starting fall 2023. So really excited to go home. Been away from home for 10 years in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, doing important work, doing research at the University of Pittsburgh. And the University of Pittsburgh has provided me with this opportunity in this space to do research. But the location has not been the best. So I'm excited to go back to California because I work with Hispanic serving institutions, and a majority of Hispanic serving institutions are in the West, and particularly the Southwest, and a lot in California. So it's just for my research professionally, it's a good move to go back home. But it's also good for my family because we will get to go back, return to where we're from. I actually was born and raised in Ventura, California, Ventura County, California, actually Simi Valley, California. And I went to Cal State University Northridge for undergrad. From there, I went to the University of Maryland for my master's degree. That was the first time I left California. And then I did my PhD at UCLA, the final stop before the terminal degree, which of course is a PhD. And then I've been in Pittsburgh ever since, doing research with HSIs.
Wow, that's a lot of hopping from CSUN to University of Maryland to UCLA. And Penn, you said, or wait,
University of Pittsburgh.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I'm trying to remember all of them. Pittsburgh and now Berkeley.
And now Berkeley. It's so much hopping around. Yeah, that's the academic life. Like if you choose this life, that it sort of comes with it if you are willing to do that. And not everybody is. It is a big sacrifice. It's hard on the person, the individual, and it's hard on the family. So it's not for everybody. I don't recommend it for everybody. It's a lot. It is. It really is. You have to personally be ready for all that jumping around. So I'm ready to settle in California and be there for a while and see my kids off to college from there and, just do good work.
That's great. That's great. What a beautiful homecoming too, especially at such a stage, a milestone in your career too.
Yeah.
So your career, you've been studying this for a while, studying HSIs for a while. My audience is primarily undergraduates and graduate students who are first-gen BIPOCs. And for folks who are less familiar with the term HSI, can you explain how you define it and how HSIs differ from other institutions?
Yes. Okay. So Hispanic Serving Institutions, they are one of several types of minority serving institutions. So the Higher Education Act of 1965 set up the legislation behind HSIs and other minority serving institutions. I think the most common, well-known MSI is historically Black colleges and universities. I think that's pretty common knowledge, right? We pretty much know that. We have a vice president, Kamala Harris, who is a graduate of an HBCU. Like, it's common knowledge, right? Like, we know HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. The history is the important part of that they have been founded in the 1800s, late 1800s. A couple were founded actually even before the Civil War, but most came in after Civil War. And particularly the 1890s is sort of lays really important solid foundation, because 1890 sets the place where the federal government basically put funding into HBCUs, but only if it was, well, it was actually land grants, the land grant or the land grab, as we refer to them, because it was a land grab at the time, right? A lot of stealing of land as this country was established. But the land grant institutions in the South, the policy was that you could establish a land grant institution if you established a separate but equal one. And that's where the land grants in the South come from, because white people didn't want Black people in colleges and universities with them. So really important history, because it was set at a time of segregation, right? Like that, yeah. Historically Black colleges were necessary because Black people could not, people of African descent, really formerly enslaved people, really. I mean, these are the immediate descendants of enslaved people and or formerly enslaved people themselves that were entering HBCUs. So such an important history. It's not the history that HSIs have, not even close. So we can't say it's the same exact sort of important historical foundational moment. HSIs have a different history. They come about through legislation that calls for a certain percentage of students enrolling. So it's 25% Hispanic enrolling. So anybody who identifies, checks the box as Hispanic, then goes into the counting of the 25%. So you have to check the box. That's the other complicated thing, because we all know we can't decide how we want to define these days. Yeah. If you fall in the H, you're like all over the place, right? We're all like trying to figure out what's the best box for us, right? And I think the reality is there's not one box for us. But you got to check that box, and then you then fall into the 25%. Now, the HSI designation did come about through advocacy. So folks that were working at institutions that had large enrollment of Hispanic population in the 1970s, early 1980s, which isn't a lot of colleges and universities, primarily in Texas, community colleges in Texas. That's where a lot of the advocacy was coming from, actually, where these college presidents and these advocates for education could see that there was this population that was really being underserved, right? That Hispanic, Latino people, Latine people at the time were not being adequately served by colleges and universities, and not even enrolling, really, at that time. So the legislation comes out through advocacy in that way, that there are colleges and universities that are enrolling this greater percentage, and some of them at a high percent, almost like an HBCU, where it's a majority Latino population. And there are HSIs like that, like University of Texas, El Paso, almost all Hispanic, Latino, Latine identified. And so that's where the legislation comes from, establishes this body of legislation where funding becomes available for these institutions. And so the funding is competitive. So HSIs are enrollment driven. You got to hit the 25%. Once you hit the 25%, you then can apply for the competitive grants. So you don't automatically get funding, which is also different from HBCUs. The HBCUs do have a designated line of funding, as they should, and HSIs do not. They have a designated line of funding, but you have to competitively apply for it. So that's a whole debate to be had in its own because there's a growing number of HSIs that are coming in. We're now at 571 as of fall 2022, 571 eligible HSIs. And the data are showing that maybe half actually get the grants on any 1 year, or might have an actual HSI grant on any 1 year, leaving a whole lot of institutions that are not actually getting any funding to do this additional work, yet they're still enrolling the 25% Hispanic. The other piece of the designation is that there's a high enrollment of low income or Pell Grant eligible or federal grant eligible. There's 4 different grants that you can fall under. And so then you have a high enrollment of Latina and low income. So there's an intersection there, which we know creates bigger barriers for people, not only to be a person of color, but also low income in this country creates a number of educational challenges. So institutions that are enrolling students who are underserved historically, yet not necessarily getting the funding to do the serving. So that's the technical federal designation.
Right. So, okay. You told us the technical and then also the distinctions between the different institutions and how some of them may or may not have access to this same kind of resources, the same kind of funding. Some of them might not have funding at all. I know you've delved into these topics more deeply in your books. And so I want to kind of go back in time to how did you even arrive at like developing this interest and HSIs, and then hopefully we can talk a little bit more about your recent book and how, you know, how your work has transformed since then.
Yes, for sure. So I actually am a graduate of an HSI. Now, when I went to Cal State Northridge, it was an emerging HSI. That was a while back. Cal State Northridge has already been an HSI for probably 20 years. So we were right at the cusp, like borderline when I was there. I didn't know that. I didn't know what an HSI was. I didn't know what an emerging HSI was. I had no idea because this isn't something most institutions use. They don't use it for recruitment. They don't talk about it. You don't learn about it in orientation. They don't blast it on the walls. It's not on the website, especially not 20 years ago when I was in college. More institutions are starting to actually embrace it in that sort of way. So we're seeing a progression of that, but definitely not when the designation first came out, which was, you know, back in 1990s, middle 1990s. But I still think a lot about my own undergraduate experience, and the significance is so powerful that like I do write about it, always referring back to my own right experience. And just even to rewind a little bit more, I did mention I was from Simi Valley, California, which for those folks that are from California know, that's a predominantly white city. So I grew up in a predominantly white space as a Latina, very strong, like Mexican-American roots. I knew who I was my whole life. I never questioned anything about my own identity. Me and my mom were just talking about this a couple of days ago, actually, how it was, you know, it's like, it was just, it was in us, right? It was my embodiment, my identity was a part of who I was. And so I knew, was very aware of being in a very white space. And when you're in a white space and you're either Black or brown, right? Because the Black and Latinos, we all hung together, and also Filipinos, also brown, right? Also brown Asians, Black and brown folks, we know when we're in white spaces because everybody tells us, right? Police tell you, teachers tell you, your peers tell you, random people shouting at you at the gas station tell you, right? Like, it's just weird. It's like, why am I such a threat, right? So when you grow up in a predominantly white space, you know that you're not white if you're not white. And so I always knew. It was very aware. And as Gloria, I was going to say the wrong person. The book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together, Beverly Tatum, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together at the Cafeteria? That made sense to me because we did all sit together. Me and all the, you know, all my Black and brown friends, we all sat together, we all knew, and we sort of took care of each other, right? We protected ourselves in those predominantly white spaces. And as did me and my family. I grew up with a lot of cousins. A lot of my family grew up in the same city with me. So we knew. So when I got to Cal State Northridge, it was very different. Like I wasn't in a predominantly white space anymore. And that's not always the case. I think my experience is kind of backwards from a lot of folks because of racial segregation and housing segregation in particular. Most people grew up in predominantly, you know, if they're a person of color, they grow up with a lot of people of color segregated in those spaces. That's you, yeah?
Yeah, I'm from the Valley. I know CSUN. I grew up in a predominantly brown community.
Exactly. So most folks grow up in the predominantly like brown community or predominantly Black community or mixing, right? Particularly in California, we see a lot of Black and brown right together. And then you go to college, and college is predominantly white because most colleges and universities are still predominantly white. So I had this really different experience, and I entered college and it was different, right? Like I knew, like it felt like people of color, and like I immersed myself in like all the things Latino, all the things Chicano, really, Chicano studies, Chicano student organizations, Chicano student programming, I mean, like anything, right? Like I just was ready to just eat it up. I wanted to absorb it all because it was new to me, right? To have so many people that were more like me, that were my peers, because high school wasn't like that. And so it was important for me. So I think of HSI as that, right? That like HSIs should be spaces where people of color feel like they belong, feel like they can find who they are, they can explore their identity, they can take ethnic studies, they can take Chicano studies, they can do the Chicano Latino graduation, right? Raza grad, whatever you call it. All of those things matter a lot, and they matter to me a lot. And the reality is, like you said, like you grew up in a predominantly people of color space. When you enter colleges and universities, even HSIs, they still feel, you know, white to people. And so that's where the research is at. There people are still like, nah, they still feel white.
Especially if you just barely made it.
Yes, exactly. And so that's how I think about HSIs, right? As these spaces that like, what if they become like, I call them spaces of liberation, right? Educational liberation, where you can be like, feel like you belong, feel like you can accelerate, where you can be liberated in your own identities. All that kind of stuff happens at HSIs. And so that's where my research really draws from that belief. I call it freedom dream in my new book, that freedom dream that colleges and universities can become that. And I mean, HBCUs in many ways are that, right? And so if there's something we could strive to, it's that. But HSIs are not that at this time. Not yet.
Can you say a little bit more about your recent book about, you call it, transforming HSIs for equity and justice? What are some of the noted findings or recommendations, or just things that you want folks to be aware, takeaways from the book? And we'll put a link to the book in the show notes too, so folks can read it for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, let me back up a little bit. So the original question I think you asked me was about HSIs. How are they defined, right? And I think you wanted me to define also how I define them, right? So let me define them first. Because that was a very technical, that technical definition, right? That I gave the federal definition. Now I've given my vision of HSIs. That's where all my research comes in. So my research defines HSIs outside of beyond the federal designation. The federal designation is those things, right? You low in high enrolling of low income students, high enrolling of Hispanic students, check the box. Boom, you can become an HSI. That's it. There's no meaning attached to it. The federal government doesn't attach meaning to it. The people don't attach meaning to it if they don't. And I say that because people are starting to make meaning of HSI in really powerful ways within HSIs, but not at all 571, not by any means. And so the research really is the meaning making. I've spent a lot of time meaning making, dreaming, researching, collecting data, and writing and developing frameworks for how we can think about HSI beyond the federal designation. And so once you get the federal designation, what do you do with it? That's where all my research comes in. And so people draw on the books, right? The books, the articles, my own podcast, right? Que Pasa HSIs, because they're trying to make meaning of HSI beyond the federal designation. And so there's people that are on the ground. I was a Title V implementer, which is the HSI grants at Cal State Fullerton, actually. And I remember trying to do this work and not having frameworks. And so when you don't have frameworks, you're just trying to make meaning of it on your own. What I've done with my own research and my scholarship is make meaning for people and give people a way to make meaning of it. And now what's happening is people are making meaning of it in their own way. Like I've given people a framework and now they're like, okay, now what if it was also this? Yeah. And what if it was also that? And what if we did this? And we're also doing this. And is that servingness? Right? Yeah. Like, because I talk about servingness and I'm like, yes.
Say more about that. What is servingness? And then maybe some examples of what, you don't have to name the entities, but like what it can look like you said, when you define it beyond the designation. What are some examples of what HSIs can look like?
Yeah, for sure. The servingness is a framework. So that was one of I'm a frameworks kind of scholar. I've got all kinds of frameworks, but that one has become pretty important for people. It's basically elevating the S in HSIs. So the Hispanic is, you got that. If you're at 25%, you got that, right? The S is like, how do you elevate the serving, right? How do you actually serve Hispanic, Latinx, Latine population when you weren't historically found it that way? So the servingness framework gives people to think about beyond the federal designation, how do you make sense of it? There's two parts of the servingness framework. One is like structurally, what do you have to do? So I'm an organizational theorist. So I talk about structurally, like your mission, your vision, your strategic plan, your diversity plan, the compositional diversity of your president, your vice presidents, your deans, your faculty, your staff. All of that is structures, the curriculum. What kind of curriculum can you take? The support programs, student services, co-curriculum, high impact practices, cultural centers, all of that is structure.
Everything, basically.
Everything, yes. When you step on the campus, all of that. I even in my new book, I talk about physical infrastructure. And so it literally is. I talk about like the murals on the wall matter, and people are like, let's paint a mural. And I'm like, yes. Because my research, actually my dissertation, people said that. They said that the place on campus where there were murals, it felt like an HSI. So I'm like, listen, it does matter to people. Like what it feels like matters to people. So physically, what does it look like? What does it feel like? And so, yeah, to your question about those spaces that are doing that, I don't like to give names because I don't want people to think there's a model. There's not a model. There's
you make of it what you will, right? Based on your resources, your population, your infrastructure. But sorry, go ahead.
No, you got it. That's exactly what it is. I say that all the time. I'm like, every HSI can be the best HSI. Because in higher ed, everybody wants to be the best something, right? We want to be the best. We want to be the first. We want to be the who knows what. You can all be the best HSI because you could be the best HSI in California, small, private, rural HSI, right? That's different than the large public research HSI, right? Like it's different than New York. It's different than Puerto Rico. It's different than Florida. It's different than Texas, right? Like all of that comes into play when it comes to being the best HSIs. Like, where are you located? Where are you situated? What's your mission in general as an institution? So I very much define it in that way. Exactly how you said is like, yeah, you make meaning of it. But the folks that are doing the most progressive work, I will say, they are embracing this organizational approach to servingness. So hiring more people of color, that's huge, particularly faculty. You need more faculty. That one is the biggest barrier right now. It's hard to hire faculty of color, apparently. It's like, I don't know why I say apparently, because there's a lot of people that you could hire, you're just not. There's a lot of people of color with PhDs who could be faculty, researchers, right? Like teaching faculty, like depending on the kind of faculty you want, because every institution has different kind of faculty. They're out there, but you gotta make that intentional effort to hire folks of color. So the hiring of folks of color, the rethinking of the curriculum. I visited one campus and they had me meet with their general ed committee. And I was like, oh, what's this going to be about? And they were like, well, our provost wants us to enact liberatory education the way you talk about it. And I was like, oh, dope. So y'all read my book. Because I talk about liberatory education in there. What is, and liberatory from like a Palofarian sort of liberatory, that education can be liberating. And so they're like, here's the different ways we're thinking about. What do you think? Right. I was like, I love it. The fact that you're trying to enact liberatory education in general ed, that right there, like I'm already on board. Let's go. Right. When is it going to be across the curriculum? And the gen ed is the place where it's going to hit the whole curriculum, because everybody has to take gen ed. So rethinking curricular structures, rethinking support services, right? How are we serving the students? My podcast in season 3, we're talking about linguistic servingness. We just had I recorded an episode with folks talking about serving multilingual people, and that's such a part of HSI, because you have a good number who are heritage Spanish speakers, but you got a lot of languages, not just Spanish, in colleges and universities, right? Like there are many of languages. How do you serve multilingual people rather than do what we do in the US, which is tell people they have to speak English? When are we going to stop doing that? Because they do that to us K through 12. And then we get to college and we think that that's the only way, because we've done it all our whole lives. Colleges and universities actually could be better, right? About like embracing a more multilingual approach. And so HSIs are thinking about that. How do we serve multilingual people, heritage speakers who want to get stronger in their heritage language for their careers? Right? Like for their advancement, right? Their own social mobility, which is an important outcome for colleges and universities. We want people to get jobs and become economically mobile. What if they could do it linguistically in multilingual ways, which would advance them even more? So embracing all the ways that Latina people show up and rethinking how we can address educational needs through this like much more multidimensional lens.
Great. I can't help but think about, I have someone that I work with who just filed her dissertation, and one of the chapters, she was looking at the use of languages among Oaxacan folks, or Oaxacan Americans here, who are who speak Zapotec and are trying to access that language, and how for some folks it was so empowering that they actually access careers in like translation and interpreting, things that they never would have thought about if they hadn't had access to support services for the language part, having access to learn and keep developing that skill. Anyway, I think I'm so glad that you mentioned these examples, because they're all so different. And like you said, I imagine each institution is different too, that is enacting these different types of servingness. So okay, I was gonna ask, I want to talk about your podcast, but first I want to talk about, okay, you make it seem like just do this, just do that, like just figure it out. But I know higher ed, things are not always that easy. So what are some of the challenges, and what are some of the opportunities that you notice HSIs are facing right now in promoting equity and justice, in their own way, for minoritized, historically excluded populations? Like, and what are you noticing in terms of trends of how they're evolving?
Yeah, for sure. You're right. When I say it, it sounds really easy. I'm like, here, I give you a framework even, If you read my book, it's like right there, like, come on, what else you want me to do? Do it. I could come do it, but you got to pay me, no. But that's the reality, is the doing is hard, and I joke about that, but I also acknowledge all the time, particularly when I give public lectures, I'm like, this is hard work, y'all. I've done it, right? It's not that I haven't done it. I have implemented Title V grants. I have thought about organizational change. It is really, really hard. And you have to slow down and take it one day at a time, 1 year at a time. This HSI, becoming HSI, like the way I dream about it, is going to take years, right, for institutions to undo what they've done and do it differently. Because that's really what I'm calling for, is like, do it differently, right? Like, let's rethink higher ed. And so there's that, right? That organizational change takes time. And that's how I write about this work, is it's organizational change. Now, are we changing? To your second point of your question, yes. And I'm an eternal optimist. So I'm like, we can do this, right? Like I am seeing it happen. And I admittedly, I see it happen. And then I see like 3 steps forward and then like 2 steps back, right? Like that's the reality too, is like, this is such hard work that happens. Particularly when you have like a champion or a few champions and those champions leave, they take their champion and their knowledge and their will and their everything, their resources with them, and then they go change somewhere else, but you're back trying to keep going. Which is why I talk about the organizational approach, that like you can't rely only on one person, because like that happens, right? Like organizational change cannot be one individual's person's like dream only. Like everybody's got to be on board with it. But yeah, so what are some of the ways that I see? Well, for one, I think just the reality that we're enrolling more people of color is a change, right? We have to acknowledge that. So the fact that in the 1980s, there were very few Hispanic, Latinx, Latina people entering colleges and universities. Like it just wasn't where we were at. And so come the 2000s or so, we start to see a lot more higher increase, right? So in the last 20 years, we've seen that increase. So do we change as institutions? Well, yeah, that was a change, right? That took time. Now we have to also acknowledge that people have demanded their way in, right? We have had people who fought so that we could be in colleges and universities. And I acknowledge that all the time, right? Like I know people who fought for me so that I could be where I'm at, right? Even at the level to be a full professor with tenure at a UC Berkeley, like that was like, there were people that fought so that I could get that. And
fought specifically at Berkeley too.
Yes, exactly. Yes, to make it full circle, right? Like, yeah, because I mean, 30 years ago, that wasn't the case, right? You weren't seeing Latinas getting full professorships, right? The Latinas fought their way, right? Like our elders, I talk about my scholar elders. I'm like, I know my scholar elders have fought for me, right? I know I can name, right? Like women who have fought so that I can be, and so that my path was easier, actually. It was, right? It was, but that's because those fights have already taken place, right? And so we're still fighting our way in, we're still fighting different battles. But things do change, right? And so we have to stay hopeful. We have to know that they'll get better. We have to know that speaking up matters, that we do need to speak up, and we do need to fight those battles, even if we never see the fruits of our own labor. And I think about that, right? You mentioned, people fighting at Berkeley, right? Like 1960s, right? Like was it, all the movements that were going on. Some of those folks never saw. They don't see what it looks like now, and how what they did matters to those of us now, and what we're doing now is going to matter in 40 years in a different way that we might not see. But you fight the fight anyways, right? That's justice. That's the kind of social justice work that those of us that actually care and want to make a difference, that we do it for that reason, that we're like, we might not never see it, but we're gonna fight the good fight anyways, and we know it matters for the future, right? For the future generation. So yes, colleges and universities are changing. These things that I'm talking about, I document a lot of things that are going on, that are changing, and then I also write about things that are still happening that are not good for us. Like, one of my most recent articles is about co-authored with one of my doc students about racialized and gendered experiences of Latina faculty at HSIs, that like Latinas are experiencing racism. They're experiencing the patriarchy, right? That they have very different experiences, not only from white folks, but from men and men-identified people, male-identified people. So women and femmes, trans women, are having different experiences in colleges and universities, and still having to fight a fight. And so we're documenting that as well, that like, yes, change is coming. Yes, change is happening, but also bad things are happening too. So let's not pretend just because there's a lot of people of color at HSIs, particularly at the undergraduate level, that now racism doesn't live here. Racism still lives here. It still lives here amongst the students. Even the most diverse population at the student level, there's still racism. There's still anti-Blackness. There's still anti-indigeneity. You mentioned indigenous Latine people. There's folks doing that research. Gabriela Covat Sanchez was on my podcast season 1. She talks about that, right? Latine indigenous people don't fit into the same construct as domestic born US, Latinos, without any connection to our indigenous roots, right? Yeah, we can say like, oh, I have indigenous roots, we were colonized, but if you don't know those indigenous roots, you've never been brought up with those, you don't know what that means. That's a different experience. And so that's happening. The anti-indigeneity, even within the Latino community, is happening. So it's like, it has to be both. Like, here's some progress, but also we're not making enough progress when Afro-Latinos and indigenous Latinos are not having good experiences at the hands of our own people. That's a problem. We need to have those conversations. We need to come into some racial reckoning and some racial healing, and we need to do it fast because it's the reality right now.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because that's something that comes up a lot when folks think about even the term Hispanic and how problematic it is. But also talking about having conversations and having the necessary conversations, brings me to asking you about the podcast and kind of why you decided to start a podcast. I imagine it's another way to keep uplifting the voices of, the people who are doing this kind of work in the groundwork and research work. So can you tell us a little bit more about the podcast, about ¿Qué pasa, HSIs, and what you envision for the future? You gave us a sneak peek of season 3, but what else is to come?
Yeah, for sure. So the podcast, I really created the podcast. So as a researcher, one of my biggest issues I have with research is that we do all this research, scholars spend all this time, we get grants, we spend money, we collect data, we fund graduate students, we write, we go through the review process over and over, revise and resubmit again and resubmit again. And then our article gets published, 4 years later after it started, like literally from the start of an article, from the start of a research project till it gets published. And 100 people access it. It's like nobody's even accessing that level of research, not because they don't want to, but because it's inaccessible. You have to pay to access journals, right? Like peer-reviewed journals. There are very few that are open access. This article I just mentioned about the racialized gendered experiences, I paid as a researcher, because I had the grant money, extra money to make it open access so other people wouldn't have to pay. Every person should have to pay $25 to access an article. That doesn't make any sense, right? And so that
not every scholar can afford to pay to make it open access either.
I was just trying to get rid of my grant money. So so I acknowledge that privilege too, right? Because I was trying to run out this grant. So I was like, well, shoot, let's just use it for let's use it for good. I'm all about that. Let's use funds for good. And it's an acceptable use of grant funding to do that. I highly recommend anybody that can do it to do it. But yeah, that's a privilege also to be able to even make, and it's not cheap to make your article open access. I'll say that. So my doc student was like, what? And I was like, it's okay. It's okay. It's all good, baby. We'll get it. We got it. But so we made it open access, and still it might not be accessed by the masses, right? And so for me, ¿Qué pasa, HSIs was like, let's make it for the masses, right? I want to make research available for people. The other thing was I was seeing in various ways in my own, as a scholar doing different work with different communities, that the practitioners who are doing the HSI work were also not accessing the research. So I'm writing all of these articles, books, frameworks. I'm giving you the framework, and you're not even reading it. And I'm not blaming you for that. I wrote an article about that too. I was like, I don't blame you.
That's hilarious. I wrote an article about that too.
I did write an article about it. I do. That's where I take, I am a writer, right? So I take it to the I would say the pen and the paper, but we all know it's not pen, it's laptop, right? So I take it to the keyboard and I write about it, right? I'm like, okay, listen, I know you're busy. I got it. I'm busy too. So how can I make the research more accessible to you, right? And so the people that I want to access my research, because I do research so that it actually makes a difference, right? That's where the scholar activism comes in, that like, I'm not doing research so that I get money or I get paid or I get book deals. Like that's not why I do research. I do research so that it actually makes a difference. So they can actually create, right? And like, not everybody has that in mind. They just want to get promoted. They just want to get the grants or whatever. I'm like, no, I want to make a difference. Believe me, in comparison to a lot of scholars that have full professorship right now, I don't have that big grant money. I use pennies, right, to get the research, right? I'm like, I'll do the research on pennies and get it out there, right? Like, I'll do what I got to do. I fund my own podcast because I want to make the research accessible to people. So Que Pasa HSIs is the space where people can, as you know, with the podcast, listen for free and learn about what's going on. So that was the biggest thing, is like making research accessible. The other thing was, like you said, lifting voices, right? Like there's lots of voices. For me, it's providing space, right? For folks who are doing really awesome work at HSIs, but they aren't writing about it because that's not their job. They're doing other things, right? Like writing about it and writing an article about it or writing a book about it is not what they're doing right now. And so it's like, okay, spend an hour with me and tell me what you're doing, and tell of all of our listeners, and let them learn with you. So it was a way to, provide that space and that platform for folks who are doing really awesome work. Let them share it with folks, and really sharing best practices. Like, I just want us all to learn from each other, and people have a lot of great ideas, and a lot of them are not mine, right? Like, I've written about a lot of HSI stuff, and there's a lot of people that I have done not only written, but done really cool HSI stuff that I never even thought of. I'm like, I love that. Let's share it with others, you know? And so the podcast, Que Pasa HSIs, really is that, like, making knowledge accessible to the people who need it.
Right. And I mean, what do you envision doing with the podcast? So you're already doing a lot. I mean, it's a whole project of, sharing the work to the masses. It's a lot of work. I know. I'm doing it. I do the podcasting too. But future Que Pasa HSI, like, what is the vision of the podcast? Is it so that more folks can take these best practices, put them into practice, and continue doing the work of the becoming process, of the servingness, of the implementing, all that? But what else do you imagine doing with the podcast in the future? I don't even know. I'm like, is this going to be a continuous thing, or
No, that's a great question. For sure, going to continue to do it, going to continue to offer it. It's interesting. This season was a little different because the first 2 seasons, like, I had all like my HSI scholar friends, or like the top people in my mind. And so season 3, I was like, okay, I kind of, I've already provided that platform for all the people, all the awesome people I wanted to share the space with. And so I started asking people, right? And even, when folks that come on the show, they recommend people. And so there's a good number of folks that I had never even met, but people recommended them, and they're like, oh, this would be a great person. They're doing good work. And I'm like, awesome. So I am now extending my network, meeting really cool people, doing really awesome things. But yes, continuing to share the space and continuing to share the knowledge is definitely in the foreseeable future. I think some other things, like, people are trying to give me feedback on how they're using it. So like, one person like emailed me, and they were like, yeah, we are using your podcast as part of our professional development offerings. And I was like, oh, right. Like, so they're using it as part of their professional development, that like folks have to like listen to the podcast as part of their professional development. I was like, okay. And the only reason they emailed me is because one of the episodes was they couldn't access it on my website. Because it's available in a lot of places, but they were accessing it from my own website. And so I was like, oh, okay, that must be we didn't link it the right way. As you got to do a lot of linking and different, in order to make sure it goes live, right? Every platform has its different ways that you got to link it and whatnot. And so even hearing that, like, then I start thinking, okay, well, how does it become a part of a professional development series, right? Like, do I make it that, right? How do I make it marketing it in that way, right? That it actually is that level of learning. I mean, I have a vision of going through it and just listening to all the episodes again and writing out all the themes, right? There's so many themes that come out. And so it's like, wow, and people tell me, they're like, I listened to like the same episode like 4 or 5 times, right? Like I listen one time, the next time I take notes, the
Yeah,
next time I listen again, just to hear it again and make sure I heard it
yeah.
correctly, right? Like they really are accessing it for the knowledge, right? It is a knowledge space. So yeah, I think it's a good question. And I think I am still thinking about
I can
that.
already envision it, and not just for professional development, but in a bunch of different spaces, whether it's, Chicanx, Latinx departments, higher ed
Mm.
departments, you name it. And also, like, I can envision your book 3, 4, 5. I don't know how many books you have, but like whatever the next number of books be kind of inspired by some of these conversations that you're having. So it's very, very exciting, just like how much you can do with this. And also the increased accessibility to, like you said, for folks who aren't like able to access the paywall stuff, or who aren't always on their computer actively reading academic articles. They can pop some headphones on and listen to the work that you're sharing. So that's really, really great.
Yeah.
All right, we're getting close to wrapping up. So I have a couple more questions. I wanted to ask you for advice for first-gen BIPOC students in particular, for those that are either enrolled in HSIs or are considering attending HSIs for grad school. So maybe they're at an HSI now, maybe they're not, and they're thinking, okay, that's going to be the next place I go to. What are some things you want them to keep in mind?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. So I'll start, because my research brain is always in the research. So I'm going to start by saying that the graduate population at HSIs does not mirror the undergraduate population. So, and that article, yeah. So let's start with that.
Yeah.
So, and me and my grad student wrote that article. So I know the data. We have clear data. The data show that so first of all, HSI is an undergraduate construct. So we have to acknowledge that you become an HSI because your undergraduate population is 25% or more Hispanic, Latinx, Latine. Your graduate population doesn't have to. Neither does your faculty, neither does your administration. There's no other requirement that's the lack of accountability at the federal government level, right? The federal government doesn't hold HSIs accountable for anything besides those two percentages, right? The low income and the Hispanic. And then also if you get the grants, and you have to report that what you're doing with the grant money, right? That's the level of accountability. And so a majority of HSIs are not actually graduate HSIs, first of all. So only, I think the number is like maybe 40% of all HSIs are even graduate, right? So that knocks out a good at least 60% or so. And that's an estimate. It's something around there, at least 40%, but not much more than that. And so a lot of HSIs are not even going to be where you could go to get a graduate degree, either a master's or doctoral level. But then those, let's say it's 40% or so, a majority of them are not HSIs at the graduate level. So you're entering an institution that, even when you get to your program, is still predominantly white. So the undergraduate population might be all thriving and diverse and all that. And then you went to your graduate degree in, let's say, history, and it's probably pretty white, right? Like the faculty and other grad students are also white, and maybe probably the curriculum. I mean, I named history in one of the whitest colonial spaces on any college campus, right? Unless you're taking it through ethnic studies lens, you're getting the colonial problematic history of higher ed, of the US and beyond, right? Depending on what history you're studying. And so it becomes very white again, really quickly. So I think that's important to acknowledge that HSIs are still not HSIs at the graduate level necessarily. Some are a little bit better, and then it's program based, right? So depending on your program, like some programs are a lot more diverse, right? But that's like one by one. It's like a graduate program by graduate program. So I would say doing that research, if you are interested in entering a graduate program that is more diverse, understanding that like you still have to do that sort of level of research into the diversity of the student population. Ask that question. I'm a graduate, as a graduate advisor, right? Like as somebody who comes to me to get advice on the process, right? Working with me or entering our graduate program, ask faculty, ask the person who oversees the program what the diversity is. And they will tell you. and ask to talk to people of color, because they will tell you, students will tell you that it's a terrible place, right? They're like, no, don't come here. Oh yeah, that one Latina you wanted to work with, oh yeah, she's leaving to Berkeley this year, don't come, right? Like that happens, right? That happens all the time, right? Like people applying to go work with one person and then they're like, bet I'm out, right? And they should tell you that. I told my person who was coming to work with me very early on, right? The doc student who was coming to work with me, I am leaving probably. It's like 90% chance I'm leaving. I need to tell you that because I don't want you to enter this space without knowing the truth, right? Not everybody tells the truth. So ask, right? Ask those kind of questions. Ask what kind of climate it is. Ask what the experiences are of people of color, because otherwise you're entering a space thinking it's going to be all great. Yay, I'm at an HSI. It's going to be amazing. And then it's not. The graduate population and the graduate curriculum, I'll say, pretty much across the board has not changed. So don't go in expecting that. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. I mean, once again, you're reminding us that it's all about the individual programs. So not just the individual institutions, but even more so the individual departments and programs within them that make all the difference, especially for graduate students. So thank you for that. Do you have any other closing words? And if not, how can others reach you? How can others follow you, your work, support your work? Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I guess in also the spirit of like femtoring, right? Like I said, I mean, I am on the receiving end now, right? That process of going through graduate school and going into either master's or doctoral programs, there is a lot of work to do. We're not creating a college going or not a college going, a graduate going culture, right? So I think that would be my big word first, is like, there is a program for you, right? Like get into those programs if you are trying to apply and get paid. Don't go anywhere, particularly if you're a person of color that doesn't fund you. Higher ed needs to be funding. If we want more diversity, we need to pay people. Yes. We need to pay them what they're worth. And that's everyone. That's graduate students, that's faculty, that's staff, all of us, because they should be paying for the fact that we're bringing our cultural knowledge, our community cultural wealth comes into the institution with us. We are single-handedly changing institutions just by entering the spaces. So yeah, so go get those programs, go get those funds, go work with those folks you want to work with, like do that, right? Get the advice, follow podcasts like this, follow, I know there's Instagram accounts, influencers, people who are helping, particularly grad students of color, figure out or demystify the process, right? Because it's a process, and there is an unwritten curriculum. Right? There is totally an unwritten curriculum to how to get into and through graduate school. So making sure you're accessing whether it be through a podcast or through a book, those books are written too, right? Like get the book, get the podcast, follow the influencers. I follow the influencers on Instagram just because I like to learn too, right? And I've been, I don't need like how to write a, the personal statement for the grad school, but I just like, I just like supporting and learning too of like, yeah, what is, how are people perceiving this process that I'm on the receiving end now? Yeah. And also doing the work to break down a lot of things like we don't need GRE scores, right? Like we've fought that fight. That fight has been won in a lot of places. Good, we got rid of GRE scores. That doesn't mean that people now all of a sudden are totally opening up the doors to all people of color, because they still are using other metrics to allow people into the institution, right, or into their graduate programs. So I sit on committees with those folks who want to know about the GPAs and the what schools did they go to and the training and the pedigree. And I'm like, what does this person want to do? They want to work, they want to, do equity and justice work. Cool. I'm with it. Right. They struggled in undergrad. Cool. Many of us did. Right. I'm good with that. Let's keep talking through. Right. Like that's not the end all be all, like those normative metrics. Right. So just wanted to add that, right, from a sort of femtoring perspective. But other than that, you said, how do people reach me? Yes, I'm on social media. So you can follow me on social media, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. Those are the spaces I spend most of the time in, at Gina Ann Garcia, and also my website, ginaanngarcia.com. So yeah, I'm accessible. Find me. I'm happy to interact with folks. DM me. It goes down in the DMs for reals. Like DM me. I always respond to DMs faster than emails even.
I should have been DMing you.
I know, right? If you email me, I'm like, maybe, wait.
I'm like, what is Doctora Gina Ann Garcia? I'm not gonna DM her. I'm gonna send her a formal memo.
Nah, I'm telling you, it goes down in the DM. Yes, people DM me all the time, and that's how I be like, and then they'll start getting technical, and I'm like, can you email me? But like, you're already on my mind now, right? Now you're on my radar, so I'm like, okay, yeah, remind me that you were in my DM so I can remember.
Yeah.
But yeah, no,
That's
definitely DM scholars, DM folks.
I love that. DM scholars.
We respond. Well, at least I do. I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're gonna link all of that in the show notes for sure, so folks can reach you. I just want to thank you once again. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Doctora Gina, for sharing all of your wealth of knowledge and experience and wisdom y todo. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining me in the Grad School Femtoring podcast. If you like what you heard, here are 4 ways you can support the show. The first is to make sure you're subscribed and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. The second way is to get your copy of my free Grad School Femtoring resource kit, which includes essential information to prepare for and navigate grad school. You can access it at the link in today's show notes. The third way to support my show is to follow me on social media. You can find me on Instagram with the handle @GradSchoolFemtoring and on LinkedIn by searching my name. The last way to show your love is to sign up to work with me via my Grad School Femtoring Academy, my group coaching program for first-gen BIPOCs seeking to work on their personal growth and gain sustainable productivity skills. You can learn more at gradschoolfemtoring.com/academy. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.